Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Rebecca Carbon. I'm founder and principal of Art Plus Public, an art consultancy that brings people closer to contemporary art in their everyday lives. Today, we'll be virtually touring Annie MacDonell's The Beyond Within, which is currently on view at the MacKenzie Art Gallery. This is an exhibition walkthrough experience featuring artist Annie MacDonell in conversation with curator Crystal Mowry. This is the continuation of a series of live virtual exhibition tours hosted by Art Plus Public Unlimited, featuring current exhibitions we wish we could see in person and which we want to make sure are seen by many. So I'm excited to bring our audience to a series of tours that delves into the role artists play in making sense of the world around us, the role curators play in bringing this work to an audience, and the rapport and working relationships developed between artist and curator through the process of making an exhibition. By organizing virtual walkthroughs framed by conversation between artist and curator, we hope this series gives audience members a sense of the exhibition space, an understanding of curatorial considerations, dialogues between curators and artists, insights behind key works. And for those who've been able to join us live today, we're really excited about the opportunity for a live Q&A with Annie and Crystal. I'm joined by Art Plus Public Content Coordinator Habiba Raouf, who has been working on planning and bringing together today's event. So a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. We have a quick 60 minutes together. It will go fast. In a minute or two, I'm going to hand over to Crystal and Annie, who will walk us through the Beyond Within. And we'll wrap up our session, as I said, with a live Q&A. So please do throw some questions in the Q&A box. You can find the button for that the center bottom of your screen. And then the session is being recorded, so it will be up in our YouTube library within the next few days. And you can share it. If you enjoyed it, share it with people who weren't able to join us live today. So now it is my great pleasure to formally introduce my distinguished guests, the people you've tuned in to hear from, artist Annie MacDonell in conversation with curator Crystal Mowry. I have been lucky enough to work with both of these individuals over the past few years, and I'm really looking forward to our next hour together. Annie MacDonell is a visual artist and filmmaker. Her early training was in photography, and the image continues to play a central role in her projects. Her work also includes installation, sculpture, writing, and performance. She received a BFA from Toronto Metropolitan University in 2000, followed by graduate studies at Le Fresnoy Studio National des Arts Contemporains in France. Or I think that's mercifully the only French part I have to say. Her film's Book of Hours from 2019 and Communicating Vessels, which she developed collaboratively with Maître Fortuné in 2020, have screened extensively internationally. Recent solo shows have been held at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and Gallery 44 in Toronto, Parisian Laundry in Montreal, and the Art Gallery of Mississauga. Annie has participated in group shows at the Art Museum of the University of Toronto, Contemporary Art Gallery Vancouver, and this current exhibition at the MacKenzie Art Gallery. Recent performances have been presented at Nuit Blanche Toronto, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and the Toronto International Film Festival. I'm going to take a breath for a second. In 2012, Annie was shortlisted for the AGO AMIA Prize for photography. She was longlisted for the Sobey Art Award in 2012, 2015, and 2016. MacDonell was shortlisted for the 2021 Scotiabank Photography Award. In 2020, she and Maître Fortuné won the Tiger Award for Best Short Film at the Rotterdam International Film Festival for their film Communicating Vessels, which we will get an insight into today. Annie lives in Toronto with her family and is an assistant professor at Toronto Metropolitan University's School of Image Arts. She's a founding member of Amelia Amalia, a feminist research and writing group. And it is such an honor to have Annie with us today. And Annie is joined by Crystal Mowry, who is the Director of Programs at the MacKenzie Art Gallery. Crystal previously held the position of Senior Curator at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery, where she oversaw the gallery's exhibitions, collections, and publishing activities for over a decade. As a curator operating primarily within the context of public art museums, she treats her role as equal parts co-conspirator and translator, often seeking ways to support artists in the development of new projects that complicate institutional narratives and processes. I always enjoy Crystal's exhibitions. Her curatorial work includes group exhibitions such as the permanent collection, What the Bat Knows, I'll Be Your Mirror, The Perennials, and Romancing the Anthropocene, which was one of 3 zones commissioned by the City of Toronto for its annual Nuit Blanche event. Crystal's solo projects with Ontario-based artist Maggie Grote, Ernest Detweiler, and Deanna Bowen have all received Exhibition of the Year awards from the Ontario Association of Art Galleries, now called Galleries Ontario Galleries. And in 2020, actually, incidentally, the Deanna Bowen show, we also did a virtual exhibition tour of, and you can see that in our library. In 2020, she was a recipient of the Waterloo Region Arts Award. Her writing has appeared in various artist-focused publications on the work of internationally active artists such as Brendan Fernandez, Sherry Boyle, August Klintberg, and Deanna Bowen. Crystal is a member of advisory committees for C Magazine and Critical Distance Center for Curators, and regularly participates on industry juries, most notably the Sobey Art Award in 2015, the RBC Painting Competition 2018, and the Scotiabank Photography Award in 2021. Crystal was born in Toronto, where she completed undergrad studies in sculpture and installation at the Ontario College of Art, and before completing a master's in fine arts at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax. Annie and Crystal, it is such a pleasure to have to hand the floor over to you at this time. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, Rebecca. All right, everyone. Thank you all for joining us from your respective locations. It's such an honor to get to spend time with Annie and this exhibition again. I would love to have given or contributed to the conversation from the actual MacKenzie, but we have a kind of a SketchUp model to approximate that space for us today. There have been different points in the last, I'd say 20 years, that I've had a chance to connect with Annie and her work and see over time motifs that never quite leave her practice, but find ways to return in kind of new forms. And I love thinking about the Beyond Within as a project that contains a lot of those motifs and interests, but it's also kind of finding a way to complicate and maybe make more complex historical foundations for ideas that have shaped some of the works in the exhibition. This project has been it's a touring show, but not really organized like a conventional touring show. It's relied heavily on collaboration from guest curators or host curators at each institution it's traveled to. And I should say too, it's shaped largely with the collaborative effort of Leela Timmins, who isn't with us today, but Leela is the senior curator at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery in Oshawa. And I think Leela's work with Annie, in particular, I'm thinking about the Communicating Vessels presentation at Gallery 44 is really a point when I started to think, oh, I want to be able to support a major solo exhibition of Annie's work. So we're gonna be talking about that work a bit today. What I'm going to do for us is show a few transitions into the space, and Annie and I are going to have some conversation about individual works, and it'll be pretty informal, but it will also, and comfortable, I guess, but it will also, maybe Annie, I hope you feel this way, be shaped in the spirit of collaboration that informs some of the works, two of the bookending works in the exhibition, Communicating Vessels, and Out Here, that were made in collaboration with Mater Fortuny. So this is what you would see, the kind of didactic signage as you enter into the space. And I can read a little bit of this copy just to kind of get us started, and we'll hand things off to Annie shortly. So the exhibition is titled The Beyond Within. As I mentioned, it's a show that's traveled, and its first stop was at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery in 2021. And from there, it went to the Robert McLaughlin Gallery, or no, SFU first.
Yeah.
I'm going to get the order mixed up. I'll just list them. SFU Galleries in Vancouver, Robert McLaughlin Gallery in Oshawa, the Illingworth Kerr Gallery at the Alberta College of Art and Design University, or AU Arts it's now called, and it's currently at the MacKenzie Art Gallery. So a bit of the didactic copy because it's small and folks may not be able to read it. As a surface with only one side, the Mobius strip resists orientation. To trace its surface is to experience left becoming right, outside flipping in, and time assuming the shape of an infinite loop. While the loop's perimeter is defined, it is the twist in the loop that prevents predictability. Within static institutions and other familiar containers, is it possible to experience a similar twist, a radical detour that encourages us to build our worlds anew? Underpinned by feminist concepts of the everyday as a basis for political engagement with the world, Annie MacDonell's predominantly lens-based practice questions how images are constituted and circulated, beginning from the photographic impulse to capture and frame. Annie frequently uses found images to propose strategies for our personal and political representations. Annie's recent work looks to under-recognized sites of experimentation as full of artistic and political possibility. Psychedelic experience as a means to dissolve the ego and generate new models of collectivity is central to the works in this exhibition. Juxtaposing text, drawings, and photographs sourced from early psychedelic trials with architectural sets that recall the institutional examination rooms in which these trials took place, Annie's work proposes a boundary between the subject and viewer that is not only marginal, but also porous and continuously shifting. By making use of radical and lateral modes of thinking and storytelling, Annie affirms how art can be a necessary clarifier and serve as an essential tool in world building. So this is a plan view of the layout of the exhibition, and the space that it's in at the MacKenzie is kind of like a galley shape. It's a long corridor, not necessarily narrow, but certainly predicts a certain kind of, or prescribes a certain kind of path through it. And in designing the exhibition, we really wanted to respond to what that shape is and to think carefully about how a kind of unfolding of maybe of a narrative, but also a set of relationships could be made apparent through how we were situating individual works in the show. When you come into the show, you kind of come in through, well, there's several entry points, but the primary entrance allows you to kind of go through a twist, to go through a corridor. So in a sense, your movement is emulating some of that that description of an unpredictable path or a kind of serpentine path like a Mobius strip. And the first work that you encounter through that primary entrance is communicating vessels. So this is, if you were moving through the path, come into a projection space. We're going to land on this image, and maybe I'm going to turn it over to Annie because I've been talking so much to give us a bit of an introduction to that work.
Sure. Thanks, Crystal. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of the space as like a strip that could be twisted into a Mobius, but I really like that analogy now that I think of it. We talked a lot about how to make the exhibition work in the space and in the context. And we landed on this structure that's sort of like a bookend with the two longer films. The films are both around 30 minutes, and they're both made with my collaborator, Maider. So they're not really walkthroughs. I mean, you can walk through them, but you know, they are films that you can spend time with. And there are a lot of themes that run through all three works and are sort of emphasized differently in each one. So I really appreciated at the MacKenzie the way that they were able to create these different viewing spaces as well. The rooms that the videos are played in are quite large, and the projections are beautiful and almost, especially with communicating vessels, almost cinema scale, which for me as a viewer, I always really appreciate in a video viewing experience in a gallery space, to be given some space, to be given an image that takes up, that calls or demands a little bit of attention and to be given some comfortable seating. And the MacKenzie was able to do all of that. Communicating Vessels was made, I think, to get my dates right, we shot it in 2017, like Crystal said, with the support of Leela Timmons when she was at Gallery 44. And we shot it as a multi-channel video installation to be shown at Gallery 44. And it's, I think what's interesting about it in the context of the exhibition is it was really the place where a lot of the ideas that are worked throughout the exhibition began. Maida and I first started talking about it in 2015, and we had made ourselves this sort of map of everything we wanted to fit into the film, which was very ambitious and very large and very extensive. And in the end, you know, we were only able to cover aspects of the map in the film. But then I realized in retrospect now, looking back on it, that all the ideas that didn't end up in this film were sort of, you know, explored more fully in the rest of the works that came after that, you know, fill out the rest of this exhibition. So Communicating Vessels is, after it was shown at Gallery 44, we then spent some time re-editing it into a single channel video, and that's the way it lives now. It's is shown in cinemas and in gallery spaces. And it's a sort of complicated story. Like, there is a very strong narrative to it. There's a voiceover that runs throughout, telling the story of an exchange between an art student and an art teacher. And in the beginning, the image and the story are sort of in sync, and then as the film progresses, things fall more and more apart. And at the time, Maida and I were really thinking about trying to work through some of the questions that we were encountering, reaching a certain stage in life, both being in our 40s, we had done art school together in our 20s. And we were both art teachers. We had both become parents. So we were sort of thinking about this position in the middle of your life when you feel still connected to, you know, the early part of your life, but all of a sudden you also have this new perspective on the second half of your life that's to come, that feeling of like connection that you can only really achieve when you get to the midpoint of life. And we wanted to tell a story that would connect a character and create a lot of slippages between characters at those different moments in our lives. So we situated it in an art school, and we loaded the film also with all kinds of references to other artworks and other moments, other art historical moments. Do you think that's a good description, Crystal?
Oh, I think it's a great description. And I think this work does something really special in establishing a relationship between two collaborators, but also the kind of influence that moves between collaborators. So the title of the work, Communicating Vessels, for folks who maybe are less familiar with the term, is borrowed from physics. So it's a principle of kind of connected chambers that always seek equilibrium, regardless of the tilt and the effect of gravity on their location. And before seeing this work, I'd never really thought of that analogy having an appropriate place in describing what relationships are like between instructors and students, but also collaborators or parents and their children as well. And I think throughout the film, there are certain points where it's hard to tell whose version of the situation is the more authentic one. But as a person experiencing the work and who has returned to this work a number of times over the years, I don't find myself ever getting closer to a sense of certainty on whose perspective, whether it's the student, or the narrator who's framing the experience for us, is the one that should be trusted most. It's not even that important after a while and experiencing it. But there's also, I think, within this work, you and Miter do a really, you make a really effective model for understanding how within artistic practices one can return to situations often. You know, again, it's like that kind of a twist in a loop that might bring you back to a certain point. And, you know, we start to question whether the narrator's perspective on the situation may be, or what she's sharing with us is actually potentially a retelling of her own experience as a young person too. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how the dialogue for the script for this work was conceived, and what that was like to kind of finalize some of those details. There's a lot of references to other artists' work throughout this piece too. And, you know, how did you and Miter decide who the quotations that would be most important for this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I spoke about that map, it was really our departure point, and we worked for a long time on the ideas before we had a narrative to attach to it. And we got to a point where we had like a sort of short list of 5 stories that we thought might be like containers that would allow us to talk about all the things in our map. And in the end, we wanted something that was autobiographical in some sense, even though we knew we were going to you know, rewrite it in many ways. And in the end, we ended up with a story that had happened between Miter and one of her students in France. But then, you know, from the beginning, that was just, again, it was like another container, and we started to rewrite it. So, you know, as we were writing the story, we added in things that we had lived through together as students. We added in things that we had lived through separately as teachers and parents. And also, we started to, you know, a lot of the film is showing works that the student has produced. But in fact, from the beginning, we wanted those to be performance and video works from artists from the 60s and 70s that had meant a lot to us. So there was also, like, when you talk about the twist in the Mobius strip, there's this twist of like reassigning the masterworks that had influenced us a lot to a student in the story. Yeah, in this film, it's there's a Lygia Clark piece, which is the Mobius strip piece where it's being sliced with, yes, this one here, which the student is slicing it with scissors. There's a Joan Jonas piece, video piece, and Dennis Oppenheim, the 2-stage transfer drawing. So yeah, we're creating also, you know, it was about time and like thinking about the way that ideas circulate from artist to artist, sort of compressing and expanding actual historical time, and the way that certain images return over and over again in contemporary art. Yeah, so I guess we came up with the ideas first, and then we came up with the narrative, and then we started to sort of inject it with all of the art historical references.
There's a lot of history in this exhibition that precedes you and your lifetime too, right? So whether it's the reference to those artworks from the 60s, or even much later on, we'll get to Lee Lozano's work. And, you know, the room that we enter into next, or the zone, I guess we could say, is heavily shaped by history from the 50s and the 60s. And this, whoops. So as you move from the communicating vessels screening space, you enter into a kind of much more rectangular shaped room where we encounter, I guess, a core work, which is set and setting, but also several related works on its periphery. And within this space, there's also video, but work on the wall that is static. And here's one image of set and setting. And Annie, I'm not sure if you want to talk about set and setting separate from the LSO protocols and Eco Death Trip, or do you want to maybe talk about them all together, because they are shaped by that same history, which is tied to a particular moment in Saskatchewan's social medicine heyday. So in the 50s, there was a period in Saskatchewan where Tommy Douglas was elected, and that became a kind of a new dawn for the way that medicine would be understood, or provincial healthcare could be understood, as serving various public needs, much more socially focused. Unfortunately, there are aspects of provincial policy and innovation in Saskatchewan that are no longer as progressive as that period, but it was such a wild time in the province, because that's when we really start to see major research on psychedelic trials and the benefits of carefully constructed psychedelic experiences to help us better understand mental health concerns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's good. All this room has to be talked about together, because it's a mix of, some of the images are pure research images, some of them are artworks, some of them are some hybrid object between research and artworks. But yeah, I was thinking a lot about the sort of like the feeling of being sort of trapped in certain types of political dialogue, and the feeling very frustrated personally with the limitations of existing political language and political strategies and tools that are out there. Feeling like more and more those were not avenues that I was interested in engaging in, but I still wanted to be thinking about the problems, the increasing problems of the contemporary moment. And in some of the reading I was doing, I started to notice an interesting overlap between some of the writing and thinking of certain contemporary anti-capitalist thinkers and some research that was a resurgence in research on psychedelics as therapeutic medicine that was just starting again in about 2010, and then getting into the media around 2015. So I started to do a little bit of research too, thinking about psychedelics as a way to sort of like unlock the imagination, imagine other worlds, imagine other ways of being together, of being connected to things. This is, coming directly from the quotes from patients who were undergoing this kind of therapy. Often, as Crystal said, it's, the patients were doing it either as support for mental health problems or addiction problems. And yeah, the language that they used about feeling connected, about feeling the self-dissolving, about a certain kind of hopefulness seemed to me to have like a strangely political side to it too. So I started to do some research, and I found out that the actual trajectory of this research into psychedelics as therapeutic medicine started strangely in Saskatchewan in the 50s, at this moment that Crystal was describing. There was this moment of, real experimentation and a desire to make the lives of the patients in mental health centers better, and to find ways to deal with addiction that would work for people that were suffering. So yeah, because of Tommy Douglas and because of certain political policies, there was this moment in the 50s where the most exciting thinking and work around psychedelics was happening in Weyburn, at the Weyburn Mental Hospital in Saskatchewan, led by a doctor from England, Humphrey Osmond. So there was this whole wonderful moment where the new research was being done, and it was very it was very early on, and so the doctors and the researchers were very intent on sharing information with other doctors, establishing certain protocols for the ways to handle the research to best serve the patients. And after this moment of like intense activity, there was, of course, the change in social ideas and political positions on LSD and psychedelics in general. So there was a moment of efflorescence, and then everything was sort of shut down in the late 60s. And then all that research was sort of put on ice for 40 or 50 years. Until, like I said, in the 2010s, some researchers in the States started to take it up again. So I was looking at the older research. I was thinking about psychedelics as this way of opening up different political conversations, different experiences personally that would then allow us to imagine different collective futures together. And I was also really interested in trying to develop some new visual language around psychedelic experience, because I think it's one of those things that seems like it's so ingrained in certain representations, like of tie-dye and the Grateful Dead dancing bears, and this sort of like late 60s countercultural version of it. Spirals, all those things we associate with psychedelics. So I wanted to talk about psychedelics, but I wanted to avoid all of that pre-existing imagery and try to figure out a different way to talk about it. And part of that was this, should we go to the posters?
Okay, yeah, I was going to say that there's also quite a bit of quotation in this space too. So not just some of the language that's borrowed from the LSO protocols, which we'll show in a bit, but also images that are sourced from articles that would have been attempting to describe and convey some of what was going on in LSD, either trials or psychedelic trials, but also in kind of other forms of usage, whatever experiences may have been the result of patients. This is a little bit of a walk through around the corner where you first encounter posters that Annie was describing. So these are the LSO protocols, right, Annie? And they're borrowed from research documents. I wonder if you can, and there's highlights throughout that maybe Annie can talk a little bit about the relationship of those highlights to some of the other elements in the space.
Yeah, so this is a document that came out of Weyburn, Saskatchewan in the 1950s, and it's the protocols that I was talking about, where the doctors and researchers were trying to figure out how to do this and do it right. And so this document, which was shared with me by the researcher Erica Dick, it's a combination of drawings made by patients as they were trying to describe their visual hallucinations. It's yes, like the nurse with two eyes, and this cube space. It's the patients trying to translate their visual experience into drawings, which I loved, especially like I was saying, I was looking for this other kind of visual language to describe these experiences that wasn't so codified already. So I was really happy to discover these. And then also the rest of the document is, a lot of transcripts of interviews of the patients who are either under the influence of the drug or sort of reassessing the experience directly after the fact. And so this became a really important document for the show. Some of those quotes from the patients and the doctors are then pulled into the voiceover in the 3-channel video work in the center space, and some of the drawings become animations in the video works as well. And I guess this is one of the works that's sort of in the hybrid space between, like, it is research, it's literally research material, but I'm also trying to offer it up, activate it in a different way in the space of the gallery, both through this highlighting, which is sort of drawing attention to certain passages, but then also by then sort of like metabolizing it and turning a lot of this material into the artworks that you encounter elsewhere in the room.
It's I love this. I love hearing about how you came to this documentation, right, through Erica Dick, who teaches at the University of Saskatchewan and who's written extensively on the history with LSD and psychedelic medicine in the province. But also there's this kind of this wonderful movement or sharing of information that can yield a new work, like yield something that's quite far from the kind of aesthetic sensibilities of research, especially, or not research, but of the archive, really, in some of the more video-centric components of the space. So this is just a bit of a continuation through that path. Between these, around the corner from the posters, between the two rooms, we see a pretty important work, I think, for the show in terms of its way to kind of physically manifest a ruptured plane, or a kind of a surface that seems to mimic almost like a lenticular photograph. So that's the ego death trip that we saw through that mirrored corridor. And Annie, that mirrored space, while it's quite it occupies very little area in the exhibition, tends to be a space where people in the exhibition gravitate towards, and it's almost dead center in the installation as well. So it's kind of that pinch point if we were to think about that looping path. I'd love to hear more about, or I'd love for you to share more about the introduction of that mirrored material, or just the material choices in general for that space where Ego Death Trip is connected to set and setting.
Sure. Yeah. So in the early research in the 1950s, early on in that, the researchers realized that, like, one of the most important things is this is set and setting protocols, which is, you have to get the patient in the right mind frame, and also you have to create the right space in order to have them have a positive experience. And so very quickly they went from, like stark white hospital rooms with patients strapped into hospital beds and being dosed with LSD under those circumstances, to realizing that, like, actually what they needed to do was make these really comfortable living room spaces within their research facilities and hospitals, which had, they had to have certain things: a patterned rug, art on the walls, a comfortable couch, ideally a stereo system with headphones, a window to the outside world if possible, art books and knickknacks. So I was really interested in that idea of, creating these sort of like almost familiar domestic spaces within the cold research environment, in order to allow the patients to sort of like dive off into a metaphysical experience. And I was thinking about that also in terms of, the ways that we activate galleries as artists, this sort of like space within a space where a different kind of experience becomes possible, a different kind of attention is paid to the things that we encounter in that space. And I wanted to have a sort of like space within the gallery space. So I created the two rooms, which are 12 by 12. And on the outside, you just see, the constructed nature of the rooms is made obvious by the fact that you see the 2x4s and the drywall. And then on the inside, you get the space that feels a little bit like a therapist's office, or these research dens or research labs. And yeah, I think when you were talking about the space as a Mobius strip, Crystal, the first thing I thought was, like, of course, the twist is the two mirrors. So I wanted to have a doubled space I guess, the idea was to create a sort of psychedelic experience of place and time, and a sort of an allusion to that dissolution of the self that so many of the patients in the LSO protocols and in the videos are referring to. So the doubling of the space is something that was actually described in Communicating Vessels, the film from a few years before. And then the mirror space does that thing where it's sort of like creating a totally illusionary psychedelic space just by the replication of the image and the replication of the self. Can we go back to the slide of the ego death trip? And then, yeah, like Crystal said, ego death trip is this sort of quite large piece. It's about 15 feet across, and it's photographic image, a found image on a sort of like corrugated metal. Yeah, this is great, thank you. And the image is from a Toronto Star article from 1967, where the reporter went to an LSD party and took some pictures there. This was sort of at the moment where people weren't quite sure, like the tides were about to turn against psychedelics, but it wasn't quite, there was still an openness around it. And he took this picture of this woman, and she's sort of like, her body is sort of like closed off. She's in some kind of sleep or dream state, sort of on her own. But what I wanted to do was take that form and break it down and repeat it to try to create an illustration of the effects of ego dissolution that's so important to psychedelic experience, and also possibly anti-capitalist movements, is to like let the self go, stop obsessing about the self and our solitude and our competitiveness, and sort of like think of the self as something that extends beyond our own limitations. So I tried to do that with her form, and also it's something that you sort of like, as a viewer, you activate it by walking along it. So because of the corrugated form, she sort of breaks up and reconstitutes herself as you walk along, and then that is further extended because she's reflected in the mirror hallway between the two research lab spaces.
Annie, I'm just going to move through these slides pretty quickly, and everyone as a heads up, we're going to move through these. The space included also these research images, right, of those trial spaces, so settings for the research, and we showed a few of those up close earlier. There's also, I mean, we're not showing clips from the video in each one of these spaces, but there's I love that you brought artists into the making of this work too, through the audio components. So we have Alia Pabani, I believe, and Andy Patterson. And
Yeah,
there's a point in the installation, I mean, Andy's voice kind of takes on a doctoral tone, maybe I'd say, or a medical practitioner tone. It seems authoritative at times, but then it kind of it breaks into song in a point that can seem very unexpected and surreal for folks who are in the space. And that the script for these works is a bit like having a kind of guided trip, or like a prescription for kind of separating what your bodily existence might be from what your mental one is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good description. We're not, the videos are a really big part of the exhibition that we're not showing, but they're both, a series of images and then a lot of voiceover. And Andy, who's a great artist and post-punk rocker from Toronto, he's this sort of authoritative voice, as Crystal said. And then in the research spaces, there's a voice that's walking you through a series of guided visualizations. And then these are images, some of them are historical and some of them are contemporary, of some of those research spaces and patients that are in the midst of psychedelic experiences.
There's some really great images that that serve as a bit of a shorthand for other forms of psychedelic experience or ecstatic experiences, let's say. So, and then also images or clips that maybe make us think about the dissolution of the self. So, this beautiful mirrored wolf pack imagery. It's both mirrored and it's inverted. So, the forms are familiar but made strange. And then there's also images of concerts or like religious gatherings, these spaces where being together and having a particular kind of experience is much more important than being alone, or yields a different kind of insight or power than being alone. Which, I mean, educational institutions are sort of supposed to be like that too, right? The kind of learning that happens with your peers and in a cohort is supposed to yield something so different and so potentially unexpected than it might be in a kind of one-to-one relationship.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, all these images are the sort of cues for the guided visualization that the video walks through, and they appear in different ways in the video. And then some of those LSO protocol drawings and quotes appear as well. And yeah, a lot of it is about collective experience, and a lot of it is about marginal experiences that are hard to describe, experiences that might be considered unserious or outside of political discourse. And I think that's something that runs throughout the whole show, like with communicating vessels, we're talking about teaching and parenthood and art making. In the central Beyond Within, it's this thing about psychedelic experience and collective experience. And then we get to the second bookend, which is this film called Out There that Maida and I made together. We finished it in 2021, which returns to an art school context, and it also has a very strong archival component to it. It's an investigation into a talk that the American artist Lee Lozano gave in 1971 at NASCAD, sort of at the height of NASCAD's importance as a hub for conceptual art and conceptual artists. And this was like a pandemic film that Maida and I made together, both of us, trapped in our homes, in our studios across the ocean from each other. And again, it was like a really deeply researched, there's a lot of archival material. And as with the Beyond Within, I think the struggle was to find a way to activate the archival material, the true historical documents, but activate them so that they come across, that they're filtered and reconfigured and reactivated in the present in some way.
Oops, I'm sorry about that.
And so, yeah, we had this audio archive of Lozano giving her talk. So sorry, to back up, her talk was called the Halifax 3-State Experiment. And Lozano at that time, she had had a career as a painter, and she was leaving painting behind in favor of a series of sort of, she called them life art works or life art experiments, where instead of making physical artworks, she would perform these social or personal experiments and then write about them on, these like very standardized 8.5 by 11 sheet pieces of paper, and then she would show the pieces of paper. But she also had this series of notebooks where she kept records of all of these experiments, smoking dope all day, every day for 30 days, for instance, would be one experiment. And then it would be, and then she would not smoke dope for 30 days. And there are all kinds of very personal things like that, and other things that she instigated sort of within her group of friends. Within the art world, she was really sort of pushing at the very limits of what was acceptable as a work of art, but also what was acceptable like socially. She was a real troublemaker, which is what we're interested in her practice and her person. And between 68 and 72, she was doing all of that personal and artistic transformation. And then in 72, she very famously did the dropout piece, where she dropped out of the art world forever and then declared the end of her engagement with the art world. So in 71, right before then, she gave this talk at NASCAD, which was the Halifax 3-state experiment, where she gave the proposal was to give the same talk sober in the morning, and then high on weed, and then stoned on acid. It didn't quite play out exactly like that, but we were very interested in this like rigorous structure that allowed for, a totally weird and wild version of an artist talk. So we returned to all the archival information, but we also wanted to make it feel like more than just a documentary. And it's sort of, the film ends with a long conversation with an astrologer named Moon Rabbit that we held over the phone, where we shared, Lozano was really into astrology among other systems. And so we shared Lozano's birth chart with this astrologer, and she did this very in-depth reading of her art practice and her life for us. So I think we think of the film as a sort of like, it is founded in the archival documentation, but it's also almost like a seance to conjure the spirit of this artist who, was sort of like twice removed from us, removed by her own decision in 72 to leave the art world, and then also removed by the fact that she died in, I think, 1989. So this figure that was sort of twice removed, trying to find a way back to her.
We could probably talk forever and not create space for people to ask questions, but we want to make sure that we open things up. And Annie, one thing that we forgot to mention is that there is an abundance of seating in this exhibition. And I say that kind of cheekily because I've never experienced an exhibition where we've had so much seating, not just as a way to kind of invite the public to rest and recline, but also in imagery. Like there are these signs, these moments, these pauses created all throughout the exhibition, and it's so generous in that way, and as you are too with the ideas that have shaped this practice. So I know that there's a few questions in the Q&A already parked, and I think Rebecca's maybe going to help us out with some of those, kind of managing that part of the session.
Yeah, thanks so much to both of you for walking us through the exhibition. It's been really wonderful to hear you both talk about the work, and I had intentionally not looked into the exhibition so much so that I could, experience it with you for the first time. I love ending with the Lee Lozano piece and thinking about that sort of the artist's scientific study of how, to embody this this thinking and this concept. And I have often thought about the crossovers and similarities between science and art as both ways of sort of troubling and questioning the world. There's a lot of similarities in there. So we do have a couple of questions. We have a question in the chat. I love how you really utilize the research documents shared by Erica Dick and transformed and presented it into this visual language for psychedelic experience without using cliche representations. Was this a moment that just clicked for you, visually seeing these transcripts right away, or did it come to be through the process of going back to it and over a kind of course of sustained study?
I mean, I was really excited by those drawings when I found them for the first time. There's something about them that is, I think it's the fact that they're so simple and rudimentary, and yet they still manage to capture something. And I felt like also, it's the transcripts of the interviews with the doctors are great, and they tell a really amazing, interesting story, but there's something very direct about the drawings. And it just seemed like it would be so much fun to animate them and make that weird nurse with the two faces and multiple eyes, to make her in the video, she becomes the main narrator and she's sort of speaking throughout. And also to, you know, there's several drawings of the research space that those patients were in, to like bring that, use that as a stage in the videos through these very simple line drawings. It just seemed, yeah, in a way, I guess it's the opposite of the like excess that we associate with psychedelic imagery. It's very minimal, and yet maybe it gets at the heart of the experience in a more effective way in some ways.
We have a question in the Q&A, which is somebody curious, do you have a history or relationship with psychedelics that inspired this work, or what particularly drew you to exploring this in so much depth?
I think it's a good question. You know, when I did an artist talk at the RMG, my dad was in the audience. And so I was like, I don't do drugs. And that was like a really weird thing that I thought about for a long time afterwards. Like, why did I say that? I mean, I have a very like a very like, you know, I'm not doing drugs all the time. I have done drugs, I have done psychedelics, you know, in a very casual way. I've never gone through this kind of therapy. And I have never pursued it in like a very persistent way. But like I said, it was more about like feeling trapped by the current political discourse, and then seeing this weird overlap between the way that these patients it was actually Michael Pollan who has become a big advocate for this. The first versions of writing about the research I read, where he was writing about what was going on at Johns Hopkins, that was in 2015 in the New Yorker. I was just struck by the language that the patients were using, and it just seemed like so poetic and like optimistic and full of what is actually possible. And then in the video, there's also there's a quote by Frederick Jameson, which I've always loved, because it's a sort of it just gets at the problem in such a succinct way. He said at one point in the 90s, he said, "Why is it so much easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism?" And so I think as an artist too, I really like that idea of relocating the problem in the imagination. And then like somehow psychedelics is just a way to think through that. I think, you know, like Crystal said, there's a lot of other ways that you can reach these ecstatic states of communal connection. And, you know, it's like going to a rave, or, you know, dance or rhythmic breathing or certain kinds of meditation. There's all different kinds of ways to get there. But just psychedelics was the one that was in the air when I was thinking about it. So.
It's also interesting to think about, and the Saskatchewan connection is a really interesting one, but thinking about how whole areas of research are kind of, there's a narrative built around them that changes the trajectory of that area of research, and that it takes then, you know, 50 years to come back around and think about like what was done, and that it was actually the kind of spin on something that affected the science, the whole kind of scientific study. So it's really, and Michael Pollan's book, the How to Change Your Mind, really goes into that, like what happened to all the psychedelic research that was really advancing for quite a long time until it became the kind of counterculture thing, which took it in a different direction. So it's interesting to think about from a kind of institutional practice and museological practice, how there can be entire study, you know, bodies of research that get co-opted by certain popular narratives. Do either of you have any last kind of comments before we sign off for this afternoon, because we've hit our time?
Thanks, Rebecca, for the invitation, and Crystal, thanks for the generous walkthrough. And I think the thing that's been a real pleasure with this show moving around has been the different contexts. So it's been shown twice in a sort of art school context, which was really, really great. And then those themes came more to the fore. And then it was just so amazing to end at the MacKenzie, which is, I mean, you can kind of tell from the SketchUp drawings, but not really. It's a really beautiful space to show in. And it's a really generous team that works there. And also to just end with that, like sort of relocating it in Saskatchewan, where the research started out, was a really nice way to end the tour of the show. So thanks, Crystal.
Thank you for that, Annie. There's some, sometimes when you're working in a space that can feel marginal to bigger city centers, where we think about, the most fervent discourse around contemporary art kind of happening, you have permission to imagine something otherwise. And I think that, that's probably exactly why the kind of innovations that we saw happening at Weyburn happened on the prairies, right? It was a space that gave you a different kind of permission to not only experiment, but be weird and not be too concerned about failure. And sometimes that can go in another way, but I think that's one of the things that makes the prairies really special. And I'm so honored to have the chance to bring this work here.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thanks to the MacKenzie Art Gallery for helping pull this virtual tour together, and moreover for supporting Crystal and Annie in making this show together. And above all, thank you so much to Crystal and Annie for doing the work that you do and for sharing it with our audience today. We've had so many good conversations over the years, and so thanks for jumping on board with us with this one. Annie MacDonell's show, The Beyond Within, is on at the MacKenzie Art Gallery until October 1st. And we have other exhibition tours lined up that we'll share with you in the future. But for now, have a wonderful day, everybody, and we'll see you all soon.